Wind carved the desert like a sculptor, lifting long ribbons of dust across the cracked road as Laleh Vaziri eased her wheezing pickup toward the chain-link fence. Sunlight flashed off loops of rusted razor wire. A toppled sign lay in scrub like a fallen shoulder plate, the faded stenciling just legible. Range Echo Test Facility, U.S. property, no trespassing. Her hands were steady on the wheel, but her breathing wasn't. The auction slip on the passenger seat, a single sheet stamped paid, felt both flimsy and unbelievable. $1,000. A base they'd abandoned, a map that was more rumor than geometry, and a dare she could not explain even to herself. She killed the engine and let the quiet swallow her. The silence wasn't empty. It hummed with heat, with the tap of cooling metal, with the whisper of 1,000 tiny lives in creosote and saltbush. She stared through the windshield at the main gate, where the padlock hung like a heavy punctuation mark, and said aloud, because the desert made you say things aloud, "This is mine." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Her father would have snorted at the gate, at the ungovernable sky beyond, at the audacity of $1,000 deed. People don't buy old bones and make them run, Laleh. Bones are bones. But he was a man who taught her to read earth like a manual, to identify soil by taste and wind by smell, to keep promises when no one was looking. She put the truck into park, stepped into heat that slapped like a palm, and walked to the lock. Keys. The county clerk had pressed them into her hand with a look that was both amused and pitying, as if she had bought an unhousebroken dragon. "You understand the parcel carries indemnity," the woman had warned. "If there's contamination, if there's unexploded ordnance, the county is not responsible." "I understand," Laleh had said. And she had in the way you understand lightning before it hits, a theory in your head and a hum in your bones. Now she tested the biggest key and felt the click resonate through the chain link like a string struck in a church piano. The gate sighed open a grudging foot. She put her shoulder into it. Gravel hissed. A grasshopper skittered away like a misplaced spark. A smell rose from within. Sun-cooked oil, mouse droppings, something metallic and old like coins warmed in a fist. The road beyond was 2 ribbons of eroded asphalt flanked by half-buried concrete Jersey barriers. Buildings crouched in the shimmer, a low administrative block with boarded windows, a squat powerhouse with a stack like a finger pointing at nothing, 2 long hangar shapes whose doors were shut tight, and, farther off, almost a rumor, the hump of a hill that wasn't a hill, a bunker shouldering out of the earth. A raven circled high and threw a single rough note down the throat of the morning. It sounded like a warning or a welcome. Out here it could be the same thing. She drove slowly, feeling every pothole in the floorboards, until the road widened into a cracked parade ground. The flagpole bare threw a thin shadow. A bell lay beside it, a bronze mouth half full of sand. The wind slid across the ground and made her shiver in the heat. She parked and took her notebook, the one she'd started on the kitchen table at 2 in the morning weeks ago, scribbling dream-shaped plans under a single bulb. The notebook was full of impossible lines. Microgrid, she'd written, with a box around the word so dark it could be a bruise. Rain capture, Maker's Hall, Field Hospital Training Suite, Desert Garden, a place that takes what they built for fear and turns it toward care. A shape moved in her peripheral vision. She spun and found a man standing at a considerate distance, hat in hand, boots the color of the land. He was tall in the way time makes men tall, by stripping away anything that isn't necessary. The wind found his gray hair and combed it back. Gate was chained. Figured if someone got it open, they were either authority or lost. "I'm neither," she said, and then softened it with a smile. "I'm the owner." He absorbed that. His eyes were pale, washed out by the sky. "Harlan Boone." He tapped 2 fingers to his temple in a gesture that had the shape of a salute without the stiffness. "Did a tour out here as a kid when the Air Guard still used the runways for touch and go. Didn't think anyone would ever claim this place again, not after they stripped it to the concrete. Do you know it? She asked. Know enough to be dangerous. Know the places that'll cut you and the ones that look harmless and aren't. You look like the kind of person who might want company the first time she opens a door.
She almost said no. The cold seam in her was pride, stubborn as a knot. But the desert had already taught her humility. It was too big for bravado. I could use eyes, she admitted, and a story or two. Boone nodded as if she had passed a test she hadn't known she was taking. Start with the powerhouse, he suggested, pointing his hat toward the square building with a stack. If you can make electrons behave, everything else gets easier. The powerhouse's steel door had a push bar gone orange with rust. She pressed, and something like a sigh came from the interior, a collapse of air and dust as the seal broke. The smell inside was animal sharp and sweet with decay. Her phone flashlight cut a cone through the darkness, full of gold floating in the air. The room revealed itself in the way night reveals a face. First shapes, then scars. There were 3 big diesel generators lined up side by side like sleeping animals, their paint dulled to a weary blue. Panels labeled with stencils, Feed A, Feed B, Main Breaker, were black with dead moths. On the far wall, a glass window looked into a smaller control room, and beyond that, another door marked Switchyard. Boone stayed by the entrance as if the building had edges that needed someone to guard them. "You'll get scorpions," he said conversationally. "Maybe a javelina will wander through when you get the doors open to air this out. That's the wildlife. The other life, the stuff people left, is the kind that bites harder." She nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mind had a way of splitting under pressure. One part cataloging, labeling, making neat lists, another part standing barefoot in astonishment. She set the notebook on a workbench and wrote, "Inspect fuel lines. Clean filters. Remove nests. Don't die." The first hour set the cadence for the day, and maybe the year. She learned made-up choreography. Step, test, pause, listen. The generators were seized, but not hopeless. Someone had drained the tanks. Someone had meant for these machines to sleep rather than rot. And then the years had arrived like silt and laid their own plans. She cleaned away a bird's nest from a control panel with fingers gentler than she remembered having. She spoke to the machines under her breath, the way her father had spoken to tractors that had become family. "Come on. Come back. Remember." By noon, she had bled from 3 knuckles and laughed twice without meaning to. Boone had disappeared once and reappeared with a cold jug of well water and a sack of green chilies wrapped in newspaper. "Payment," he said when she tried to hand him cash. "You're doing a thing I thought no one would be foolish enough to try. Foolishness deserves at least a lunch." When the sun bent west and gave up its white in favor of a gold that forgave things, she stood in the switchyard with Boone and stared at the grid of ceramic insulators, their bell shapes stacked like the vertebrae of a glass spine. The fence here was topped with coils of wire that had never been cut. A tumbleweed threw itself against the mesh and rattled like an impatient audience. "We get this to talk to a modern inverter, and then we can hang solar along the hangar roofs, maybe a wind spline out by the North Ridge where the thermal rise is persistent, tie it to storage. The desert isn't empty. It's a bank with a strange currency." Boone side-eyed her, kind and skeptical. "And what are you buying?" "A place that can hold when other places fail. A school for skills that matter. If the highway shears in a flood, if the power dies for a week, if the firefighters need a place to stage and train, this is where they come. Veterans who want another kind of mission, teenagers who want a reason to stay.
It sounds ridiculous when I say it out loud.
Sounds like a map, Boone said. Desert doesn't care if your map is ridiculous. It cares if you can carry water. They walked the rest before dark. The administrative block contained the bones of desks and a smell that was all paper and rodent. The hangars were still locked, their padlocks newer than the others, which told her someone had cared for them more recently than the rest. She made a note of the locks, the way you notice a closed mouth in a room full of talkers. There was a classroom with a chalkboard where an equation about radar cross-section still wandered across the surface like an unfinished prayer. There was a medical room whose cabinets held nothing but dust, and on the counter a metal tag stamped Type O. As the light ran thin, they climbed the hump that wasn't a hill. Up close, the bunker was a facade of poured concrete curved the way a back curves when it's ready to carry a load. The blast door was taller than a story and wide enough to admit a god. To its left, set in the wall like a secret window, was a smaller door with a wheel like a ship's helm and a panel with a keypad lame enough to be from a movie. "Don't," Boone said mildly when she stepped closer. "Things behind doors like that have their own weather." "I'm just looking," she said, but her hand went to the wheel with a want like thirst. The steel was sun-warmed and unforgiving. The wheel didn't budge. The keypad blinked a dying red when she touched it and then went dark again, as if she had been a dream it didn't feel like thinking about. "People said this hill was a storage magazine," Boone offered. "Rumors run ahead of truth out here. I heard it was an instrumentation vault for a project that saw too far. I heard it was a shelter built by men who didn't trust the men who built it. Doesn't much matter if you can't open the door." "It matters," she said, and the word sounded like a vow. She wrote the number scuffed below the panel, A3, in her notebook, and drew the rectangle of the door with all its bolts like a child who has fallen in love with a shape. They went down in the purple wedge of evening. Boone left her at the gate with a nod that contained more than it said, and she closed the lock behind him. The base seemed to exhale when night finally rose. She dragged her sleeping roll into the admin block beneath the chalkboard with the unfinished equation and lay on her back listening to a world that wasn't city quiet, wasn't forest quiet. It was a quiet that had teeth, a quiet that expected you to stay awake and earn it. She did not sleep much. At 3, coyotes spoke in accord and moved on. At 4, she sat up, wrote a page of lists by headlamp, and then another page, less useful, words that lunged around an idea she couldn't yet trap. Build a place whose first instinct is mercy. Morning came without ceremony. She ate an apple and half a tortilla and drank water that still tasted like pipe. She took the locks off the hangers in the new sun with the bolt cutter Boone had lent her. The doors skated reluctantly along their rails, and a smell like old rain rolled out, metalled and oil and something faintly sweet. Inside, the first hangar was the skeleton of a cathedral made from trusses and bolts. The floor was scarred with the ghosts of equipment long removed. But the west wall held racks, and the racks held crates, and the crates were stamped with the kind of lettering that makes a spine straighten. Surplus, NAVFC, calibration, return. She set one on the floor and pried the lid away with the flat bar. Inside was a lidded case, and inside the case was an instrument that looked like a cross between a microscope and a periscope. A laser rangefinder older than she was, built like a moral. Its serial tag said 1997. It smelled faintly of mint from the packing. The second crate held a set of geophones, the third a dusty but intact thermal camera, the fourth a coil of fiber optic cable bright as a van. She sat back on her heels and laughed. It echoed in the hangar like wing beats. "Okay," she said to no one, to the base, to the air. "Okay." Her plans shifted at that table like a map that has found true north. She saw the floor of the parade ground filled with obstacles, a miniature town made from stacked shipping containers and rescued doors,
a disaster training maze. She saw the hangar fitted with benches and solder stations, teenagers leaning over breadboards and bad coffee, veterans showing them how to strip wire without nicking copper, how to drill a hole true, how to be proud of small exactness. She saw the powerhouse alive again, not to feed radar, but to feed a greenhouse ribbed like a whale and filled with evaporative cool. Tomatoes fat as fists, basil that smelled like an apology. By noon, she had a list of names to call and a fresh set of wounds on her forearms from lifting crates. She sat on the hangar threshold and dialed with hands that shook for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. The first call went to a woman named Darla Quinn, who had a business card that said electrician, but also said other things in grease and patience. Darla answered on the second ring and did not let her finish. "You bought the Echo Range, Vaziri? That mess? You're out of your mind, Vaziri." "True," Lale said. "Want to help?" There was a long pause. "I haven't worked a place with switchgear big enough to swallow a person in a long time," Darla admitted. "I miss the hum. Text me a gate time. I'll bring coffee and a healthy contempt for OSHA." The second call found Micah Calder at a maker's space 60 miles away that smelled like plywood flowers and boyish bravado. He was 20, with a face that could still pull off impulsive haircuts, and had once beaten her in a midnight argument about whether reliability was a kind of beauty. "I'll put the word out," he said. "I've got a dozen kids who want to build a drone that can carry a liter bag of saline without slosh. Come Sunday?" "Come Saturday," she said, and the thread of urgency in her voice pulled him right through the phone. Then she called a number she had almost not written down because writing it made the enterprise move from brave to real. Marta Solano, UXO Tech, retired from a contractor that had cleaned ranges in countries the news never showed. "I can give you 4 days," Marta said. "I don't love that you're doing this with volunteers, but I like the look of your backbone, and I like the idea of teaching teenagers how not to die." By evening, a list had become a calendar. She marked the concrete floor in chalk. Here, 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 places where pallets would go, where benches needed to live, where power drops needed to descend like benevolent vines. She scrounged a broom and began the absurd work of making square footage obey her. They came. People always came to things that had the shape of a shared dare. Darla arrived with coffee in a thermos that looked like a torpedo and a suitcase of tools she introduced like saints. "This is my meter. This is my favorite wrench. This is the last pair of linesman's pliers I'll ever own if the world is kind." She walked the switchyard the way a priest walks a nave, speaking quietly to insulators with the names of their makers, dragging her sleeve across labels to read what they'd once promised. "We'll have to replace half of this," she told Lale without apology. "But the bones are better than you have any right to expect. Someone mothballed this with a tender hand." Micah arrived with a hatchback full of students who spoke in a language made of acronyms and eagerness. They made a camp in the hangar with tables they'd stolen from a church basement and extension cords that looked like a laundry of snakes. They uncrated the geophones, and 2 of the kids used them to listen to their own footsteps crossing the floor, their faces going holy with the discovery that the earth is an instrument. Marta arrived last, in a truck that had more miles than most airplanes, and a dog the color of good tea. She wore a cap with the brim sweated dark and a smile like a knife. "Rules," she said before the dog had fully introduced itself. "We treat every shiny, forgotten thing like it wants to kill us. We log what we find before we touch it. We touch nothing unless we've decided together that touching it makes sense. I will not apologize for closing a building until I'm satisfied. And if I say move, you move like love depends on it." No one argued. Rules had a way of making people feel tall.
They began to clean. They began to test. You can tell a place is waking when the dust goes from dead to alive, when it begins to rise because people are moving through it with purpose. Lale spent hours breathing through a bandana, her hair braided severely against sweat, her notebook losing pages like a tree loses leaves. She learned the weight of the hangar doors in her shoulders and the sting of cleaning solvent in the cracks of her hands. She learned the names of kids and the way their laughter bounced off steel and came back stronger. The county noticed.
This is what happens when a dead thing starts to look like it might walk. The living gather to decide if they are afraid. A white SUV rolled up to the gate on a Wednesday morning and released two men who had the resined look of people whose shirt pockets contained clipboards in spirit, if not in fact. One introduced himself as Nolan Bright, Regional Development, with a smile that didn't travel as far as his eyes. The other didn't offer a name. He offered a business card that said Compliance in a font that could have been a warning. "You've taken on something unusual," Bright observed, shading his eyes against light that did not care about his plans. "It might be cleaner if you sell the parcel to a firm with experience. There's interest in the ridge to the north for lithium exploration, and this acreage would consolidate access. You'd come out well." Laleh listened with that quiet she'd cultivated, the kind that other people read as weakness until it wasn't. "I didn't buy it to sell it," she said. "And the ridge is watershed. You drill there, the valley drinks it." Bright's smile widened by a single tooth. "We can mitigate. There are benefits, jobs, infrastructure. Let professionals handle the rehabilitation, Miss Vasiri. Let's call your purchase a catalytic gesture." "Catalysts usually survive the reaction," she said. "I'm not interested in surviving while the people downwind get hollowed out." Compliance coughed into the shape of a word. "Permits?" "We're within the code to take possession and stabilize," she said. She didn't add that she was sleeping with a copy of the county code under her pillow and had memorized the chapters that concerned foundations and fence heights as if they were scripture. "We're not conducting public events. We're not discharging anything. We're cleaning." "It would be a shame," Bright said, "if the county discovered a reason to restrict access." "It would be a shame," Boone said from behind her, so quietly that the men started, "if a bunch of veterans decided to spend weekends on public comment." Bright took in Boone's stance, Marta's dog at his heel, the kids who had stopped to watch with the intent faces of an audience deciding what to do with its hands, and revised his smile down. "We'll be in touch," he said, which is a spell that means trouble, and left in a chemically clean cloud of dust. They were in fact in touch. Letters arrived with words like abatement and liability, and language that seeks to concern. Laleh answered each with a marshal's precision and a schoolteacher's patience. "Here are the steps we're taking. Here are the tests we're running. Here is the chain of custody for every scrap of wire. Here are photographs in chronological sequence." She learned to scan and attach and archive. She learned that sometimes paper is a shield as good as a wall. The base learned too. The powerhouse began to feel less like a tomb and more like a possibility. Darla got one of the generator starters to cough in a way that sounded like speech. "Not yet, sweetheart," she cooed to the machine, thumping a panel the way you thump a stubborn heart. "But I hear you." She and Laleh argued amiably about inverter specs and load shedding and what happens to a community when the lights stay on in one place after midnight. "What happens," Darla said, "is every person within 10 miles comes here with casseroles and extension cords. You ready for that?" "Yes," Laleh said. "That's the test. If the whole county shows up, we're doing it right." At night, when the kids had gone, she walked the cracked parade ground by headlamp and practiced the sentence out loud. "We built a place where outages end." She surprised herself by crying once, quickly, breathily, because wanting something that hard is like putting your hand on a hot plate and pretending you only love warmth. Trouble came as copper theft. It always does when a place flashes its first light. Someone cut through the fence behind the switchyard and took their time sorting cables into piles, neat as morality, before loading them into a truck that left tracks like scars. Marta found the prints at dawn. "We sleep in shifts," Marta said, "and we stop pretending the desert is neutral." Boone brought a cot and a thermos and a story about the first time he'd guarded something that mattered and how fear has a taste if you sit with it long enough. Laleh took the second shift, listening to the creak of metal and the far talk of cattle and the way silence gathered in the corners and checked its watch. At 2, she heard feet. The dog's hackles rose, and so did Boone's. "Light," Marta said softly, and a beam cut the yard. A man stepped into the gap in the fence, and behind him another, and then the dark hunched as a third considered the hole and decided to stay outside. Lale stood up into her fear and let it make her taller. "You took copper," she said. "Bring it back." The first man laughed, but there was no pleasure in it. "It's abandoned." "It was," she said. "Now it's ours." That word means something. It means we're responsible not just to a deed, but to each other. Bring it back, and we'll find you work that doesn't require a fence. The man shifted, looked at the dog, at Boone's unblinking stillness, at Marta, who held her flashlight like a precision instrument and not like a threat. "We already moved it," he admitted. "We can bring cash." "Cash doesn't attach to a panel," Darla said from the shadows at Lale's left. She had moved without sound. "Cash doesn't carry electrons. Bring back the copper." They came back in the afternoon with half of what they'd taken, stripped and coiled and ready to be forgiven. Marta took down their names and wrote them in a ledger and then closed the book with a click. "You work Saturdays," she said. "You learn to sweep up your own mess, and if you bring anyone else through that fence, you'll move dirt until the ridge is a valley and the valley's a ridge." After they left, Lale asked quietly, "Was that safe?" "No," Marta said. "Safety isn't the question. The question is whether the story you're telling is a story you can live inside." A week later, the generator came back like a throat clearing after a long silence. Darla had cleaned until her arms were a map of permanent marker and grease. She threw a breaker with a caution that looked like tenderness. The machine coughed, shook itself, and then caught. The sound filled the powerhouse, filled the base, filled Lale's chest. She felt her eyes go salt-hot. Lights came up in the control room in a river of amber. An old analog meter's needle rose like a prayer. "Don't over-celebrate," Darla warned, but she was grinning in a way that made her look like a young thief. "We're islanded. We're not backfeeding. We're a microgrid with one cranky grandpa at the center, but it's a heartbeat." "Heartbeats scale," Lale said. "All life does." That night they strung work lights along the hangar trusses, and the glow made the interior feel like a theater. The kids stayed late, soldering and arguing in whispers. Mendoza, Micah's quietest student, wrote code that made a drone hover with the patience of a saint. He giggled once unexpectedly when it worked. It rose like a question mark, held still, then set itself down with the gentleness of a nurse setting a sleeping child back in bed. "Tomorrow," Lale told them, "we're testing in the yard. We're going to practice lifting weight and landing on a deck the size of a pie plate because emergencies don't wait for level ground." She slept on the office floor near the chalkboard again because you stay near the things you've convinced to wake up. At 3, the generator coughed once and made her sit bolt upright. It settled. She lay back down and practiced breathing like a person who had decided to stick around. Morning brought a letter with a seal and a language that was made of capital letters and caution. The Department of Army requested access to inspect federal property of interest, formerly known as Range Echo Test Facility. The tone implied that her $1,000 had been an error that civilized people were prepared to correct. "Call them," Boone said. "Call them first, before they find someone to dress this up as an order." She called. She spoke to a captain whose voice had the careful neutrality of a man who'd been trained to put water on fires, and his water was made of words. "We're not here to impede," he said. "We've received reports that certain instrumentation may have remained on site. It's a formality." "Come," she said, "but you'll sign in, and you'll treat my people like people." The captain was true to his voice. He arrived with 2 engineers and a retired colonel whose handshake could have cracked walnuts. They walked the base like family returning to the house where they learned to fight. The colonel stopped before the chalkboard and smiled in a way that whitened his eyes. "We should have finished that equation," he said. "We always think we'll have time to come back and complete the chalk." In the hangar, he saw the crates and tilted his head. "Where'd you get the NAVFAC returns?" "They were here," she said. He stood very still. Someone was going to come for these. Someone always says that. Then orders change. He put a hand on the thermal camera with a gentleness that made him reconsider him. This was for seeing fires that had the courtesy to be hot. We had less luck seeing the cold kind. He nodded at the bunker on the hill through the hangar door. "You open that yet?" "Not for lack of wanting," she said. "Let me try something rude." And he pulled out a keychain with 3 keys on it, each older than the last. He walked up the hill with her and Boone and the captain and the twins, 2 teenagers who had started coming every day in the summer like they were building a new kind of church. And he inserted the ugliest key in the profile of the smaller door beside the blast door. It didn't turn. He twisted, and it still didn't turn. He took it out and grinned and knocked his knuckles against the steel. Sometimes you have to introduce yourself. He knelt and pulled a can of oil from his pocket like a magician producing a coin, and misted the keyway. He waited and then tried again. And this time, the key turned like a shoulder that had finally admitted it was tired of pretending to be fine. The door opened into a throat of cool. The air tasted of iron and the sweet, secret spice of long-closed spaces. The corridor within was low and concrete, lit by emergency fixtures that were dead as perfect punctuation. The colonel took a step and stopped, his palm lifted in a gesture that was half warning, half listening.
Marta slid forward the way water moves around a rock, looked down, and crouched. "Tripwire," she said softly. "Old, and the battery behind it is newer than I like. Someone loved this enough to come back later." The colonel's face changed and something like sorrow crossed it. "We had a project in there," he said. "She was supposed to be mothballed, not booby-trapped. The world did what the world does when people trade desks. They forget to write down why they were careful. It took 6 hours to give the bunker back its dignity. Marta disarmed what needed disarming with hands that never shook and eyes that only blinked when they chose to. She had one of the twins hold the light and taught him to breathe in counts of 4, so that his trembling had somewhere to go. The colonel stayed, signing waiver after waiver with a pen that had seen deserts on other continents. He told stories in the negative, the way men do when the truth is classified or the pain still too precise. "We were trying to see the ground," he said finally, "beneath it, through it. We got good at sky. This was a bet on the earth." When at last the corridor gave up its caution, they entered a chamber that was both austere and beautiful, a round room the size of a small chapel, domed, with a ring of equipment around its base and a dais in the center like a low altar. The equipment was asleep, but not wrecked. The label said things that made Laleh's heart crawl fast: distributed acoustic sensing, fiber backhaul, phononic array. "It's a listening room," Mendoza whispered, and the words bounced up into the dome and came back hushed. "For the ground." The colonel stood on the edge of the dais like a man about to ask forgiveness. "We meant to map tunnels," he said. "We found other things while we were listening, water moving in mountains, roots speaking to each other, faults that sound like whales. We didn't know what to do with the beauty of it." He laughed once without joy. "Beauty is hard to brief." Laleh stepped onto the dais and placed her hand on its surface. It was smooth and cool, a stone that had forgotten it had ever been part of a mountain. Her mind did the thing it did when the world offered her more than she could hold. It integrated and reorganized and spit out a plan that felt inevitable. We could listen for collapse, landslides before they become headlines, leaks before they're disasters, pipes that fail before hospitals go dark. We could teach kids to hear the earth and give firefighters maps that sing.
The colonel looked at her for a long time with eyes that had seen the inside of classrooms and the outside of too many planes. I wrote a grant proposal like that once. I never got to submit it. I would like to submit it now. They worked a week that tasted like 10. The bunker systems were short-looped to the generator and then to the temporary battery bank that Darla built out of cells the size of small tombstones. The fiber on the rack in the hangar got a use it hadn't imagined. Micah and Mendoza and the twins and a girl named Asha, who took notes in penmanship that belonged to another century, learned the software the colonel still had printed in a binder, because sometimes the finest memory is paper. On Saturday, the room woke. They felt it before the gauges acknowledged it, the change in air pressure, the way a room breathes when its purpose returns. The dome gave back their words with a new tenderness. Lale stood at the console and watched the first trace appear on the screen, a line that quivered with the movement of a desert that had never been still. It was like seeing a sonogram of a planet's secret life. "What are we hearing?" she asked, her voice small in the music of it. "Far traffic," Micah said, pointing. "Wind riding in gravel. That hump over there is the old well pump house. And that," he frowned, "that's new." A bigger wave moved across the trace, slow, deliberate. Marta cocked her head. "That's feet," she said. "A lot of feet." They went outside and found a crowd at the date. Not a hostile crowd, a curious one, which can be as dangerous. Word had spread in the way word spreads in counties where people do not have entertainment but have each other. 40 people, 50, 100 by the time Lale reached the chain. They pressed forward and then held themselves back because they were decent and because the dog sat and regarded them as if it had written the rules. A woman in scrubs stood at the front with a man whose hands were burned in thin white maps. "We heard you have power. We heard you have a fridge that keeps the cold cold. We brought vaccines we can't keep at the clinic and insulin we can't keep at home." Lale had promised herself she would move slowly, that she would not run before she could walk. But sometimes the story arrives and taps its watch. She looked at Darla. Darla gave a tiny nod. "We can keep them, and we'll build a schedule. You won't have to ask twice." They did it with checklists and a ledger and cold packs wrapped in old towels and a room that smelled of promise and rubbing alcohol. The colonel stood in the doorway as the woman in scrubs laughed and cried in the same breath. Generals didn't plan this, but they should see it. He made calls. He had been retired long enough to have lost some phone numbers and to have kept the ones that mattered. The captain came back and listened and left with his eyebrows knotted in honest confusion. A week later, a date arrived as a sentence. "A delegation will visit for an informal assessment of community use." She read it twice, then a third time, and then sat down hard because adrenaline does that when it realizes it does not immediately need to be useful. They prepared like people prepare for company that can change a life. They swept until the brooms were bald. They painted the front office a color that was technically called eggshell and felt like forgiveness. Micah's students printed signage with fonts that did not apologize. Marta taught everyone the protocol for if someone in a uniform goes where they shouldn't. Boone repaired the bell and mounted it again on the pole because he said if a place can ring, it should. They argued for an hour about whether to take down the chalkboard equation and then decided to leave it as an invitation to finish what someone else had started. Lale wrote on the board in the white that makes you feel 9 years old again, "What if the ground could talk back?" Under it, Mendoza drew a little seismogram that looked like laughter. The morning of the visit began with a wind that smelled like metal and distance. The sky was polished bone. Lale wore a clean shirt and boots that had learned the base and the base had learned them. She walked the parade ground and felt that particular flammable quiet that means an event is about to instruct everyone present about who they are. The convoy came in a line that looked like punctuation, the lead vehicle an exclamation point. It rolled up to the gate and paused. Her heart performed a small rebellion and then returned to formation. She did not make them honk. She swung the gate wide and stood aside and counted. 4 SUVs with plates that did not tell stories, 1 box truck with an air conditioner the size of captaincy, and at the rear a flatbed carrying a pallet of something that had been shrink-wrapped like a caution. The first general out of the first SUV was not the retired colonel. He came from the second and stood slightly back,
hands folded, the way a man stands when he is trying to be useful without making himself the subject. The general was the kind of fit that is a religion, his haircut sharp enough to part air. His eyes took in everything and offered nothing back. "Ms. Vaziri," he said, "we appreciate your hospitality." "This place appreciates being useful," she said before she could stop herself. His mouth twitched. It might have been a smile. It might have been a tick. They toured. She showed them the powerhouse, the hangar that had become a workshop, the fridge with vaccines arranged like jewels, the ledger where names and dates and temperatures had become a quiet chorus of, "We did this right." She showed them the bunker, but not all at once, because reverence is a tool if you let it be. The general asked questions that were about risk and not about hope. The engineers asked questions about curve fitting and noise. The colonel asked nothing. He watched her team move around each other like a good kitchen, and he looked like a man who had located a missing organ. Began. The numbers clicked down in red breath. 30, 29, 28. The bunker's small panel threw its dim glow across Lale's knuckles, painting her skin the color of warning. The air felt like a coin held too long, warmed by panic, slick with decisions. Somewhere beyond the concrete, engines churned the desert into dust foam. Somewhere in the hangar, the kids had stopped breathing to listen to the siren that had no right to sing. This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. "Talk to me," Lale said, not taking her eyes from the countdown. Marta's voice arrived before the radio's hiss had settled. "Gate secure," Marta reported. "Boone on bell, Darla to power. Captains posted 2 at the admin and 2 at the hangar. Your general's got good hand signals. Nobody's panicking with him in the corner of their eye. Vehicles. Multiples. No patterns I hate yet. Not military wedge. Not a fast raid. Looks like county, volunteers, neighbors, a few cussed fools who follow sirens out of curiosity." The general stepped into the bunker's anteroom with a calm that asked everyone else to borrow it. The retired colonel was right behind him, chest rising carefully as if he'd hauled 20 years of memory up the hill and didn't want to drop a single box. "What did you touch?" the general asked, eyes on the angry little clock. "Nothing," Lale said, not taking her eyes from the countdown. Marta's voice arrived before the radio's hiss had settled. "Gate secure," Marta reported. "Boone on bell, Darla to power. Captains posted 2 at the admin and 2 at the hangar. Your general's got good hand signals. Nobody's panicking with him in the corner of their eye. Vehicles. Multiples. No patterns I hate yet. Not military wedge. Not a fast raid. Looks like county, volunteers, neighbors, a few cussed fools who follow sirens out of curiosity." The general stepped into the bunker's anteroom with a calm that asked everyone else to borrow it. The retired colonel was right behind him, chest rising carefully as if he'd hauled 20 years of memory up the hill and didn't want to drop a single box. "What did you touch?" the general asked, eyes on the angry little clock. "Nothing. That's the maintenance lockout timer. If the control sees an unauthorized power fluctuation while the inner ring's in diagnostic, it starts a purge. 30 seconds to close out processes and dump buffers so nothing gets corrupted if the power goes." "Purge what?" Marta asked, because she was the sort of woman who wanted the list before she stepped into the room with the list. "Logs. Calibration tables. The array's learned ear," the colonel said, mouth grim. "It'll wipe itself down to the bolts and leave us a very polite museum piece." "Can we stop it?" Lale asked. "Not by asking," Darla answered from the doorway, elbow slick with sweat and grease where she'd clearly run from the powerhouse. "That panel lives on a hardened loop. It thinks we're thieves. We either feed it exactly what it expects or take away what it's getting." "Take it away," the general said. "Hard power down." Darla's lips tightened. "If I dump the loop without letting it handshakes, there's a non-zero chance it'll think it's under attack and lock the inner ring.
Given the age, I don't know if that lock is logical or physical. Or we melt the door into a single thought, the colonel translated, eyes on the clock. 19, 18, 17. Lale set her palm flat to the concrete, willing it to make space for a better idea. The room was cool and humming with the smallest sounds. Fans, their breath, the dog's nails somewhere on the floor above. But beneath that, the ground's new voice, a steady pulse like a far drum. The listening room was hearing something big move in the south ridge. "Micah," she said into the radio, "give me the trace on channel 3. Static, then Mendoza's fingers in the audio as he cranked gain. The bunker's tiny speaker coughed, then translated the scrolling line into a sound like a heartbeat run through a piano. Thump, rush, thump, rush. "That's not vehicles," Asha whispered from their back, hands white around her notebook. "It's too liquid. Tailings. Pond on the old claim. If a berm went..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Every valley ear knows what a slurry sounds like on the move. "You have 10 seconds, the general said. It wasn't a threat. It was a brass plaque under a clock. Lale's mind did the thing it did when fear tried to offer shortcuts. It slowed and separated threads, laid them side by side like wire on a bench. "Can we fool it?" she asked. "If it wants stable voltage and a handshake, can we make it believe it got both for long enough to cancel the purge?" "Maybe. If we parallel a clean loop with a fake heartbeat and let it sip from that instead of the main for 4 seconds? She looked at the clock. 08, 07, 3. Hypercroticos.
The red numbers rolled back one stop to 02, then another to 01, then up like a dawn, cancel. The little screen, which had been the meanest thing in the room, now said a single friendly word in block caps, ready. "Good girl," Darla whispered, and the general let out a breath so quiet only the concrete heard it. The siren was still silent, the ground was not. The thump rush had become a roar you felt in your teeth. "Southridge is bleeding," Mendoza said. "It's fast." "Gate," Marta snapped. By the time they hit the parade ground, dust had already drawn a curtain along the road. Through it, figures resolved and sharpened. Trucks with volunteer fire logos, ranch pickups, the clinic's old van with the sliding door that only slid if you cursed it tenderly. 2 school buses borrowed from a district that could only spare buses if every driver was also a pianist at the Methodist church. The first to step down was the woman in scrubs, hair shoved under a ball cap, eyes bright with dewing. "We moved the insulin," she said without preface. "We flagged down the buses. They said the wash took a bite out of the county road a mile south and the berm by Little Nevers left." "Tailings?" Lale asked, because she needed the shape of the monster even if she already knew its footfalls. "Gray water and fine ground," she confirmed. "Chemicals if someone got sloppy. It's hugging the drainage like it paid taxes on it." "Okay," Lale said. The word helped. "Okay." She turned to the general. "If you've got a network, now is when we use it to decorate the truth, not hide it." The general had a sat phone in his palm before she finished. "Division duty," he said into the air, voice spare as rations. "This is gating party Echo at Range Echo. We have a civilian hazard, probable tailings breach at the South Ridge. Initiate liaison with county EMA and patch me to whoever answers phones at the mine office. If they pretend not to exist, tell them a general officer is outside their fence." He listened, nodded once, then handed the phone to Marta. "Talk to your county." Boone rang the bell. It surprised Lale how right that sounded, the bronze mouth singing above the parade ground while the desert threw brightness at everything like a dare. People moved toward the sound and the shade of the hangar door and the comfort of a place that felt like a spine.
We're going to do 3 things at once, Lolly said into the group. The words found their shape the way water finds the route it was always going to take. First, we route people away from the South Wash and into higher streets. Boone, you and the bus drivers know the old ranch track. String your convoy on that and don't stop the lead bus until you hit the water tower. Second, we build a line here. We can't stop Slurry with our hands, but we can slow it enough to let folks get out. Darla, can you pull the dozer? Darla grinned, hair stuck to her forehead. She's ugly and legal, let's teach her to dance. Third, Lolly continued, we listen. The bunker can tell us where the flow wants to run. If we can predict the language of its feet, we can put our bodies where the verbs are weakest. Asha, you're on the radio with me. Mendoza, you call the song. The general's mouth twitched again, closer to a real smile. And fourth, he asked. Lolly met his gaze. We make sure the medicine stays cold. He nodded once, formally, as if he'd passed a test he now wished he'd known how to administer sooner. My engineers are yours, he said. My authority is not mine, but it will walk beside you and try not to step on your toes. They moved. The base they had been resurrecting as a school turned into a working lung. Marta's dog became a sentry and grew 3 sizes. Darla coaxed the old dozer out of its nap with a cough and a curse and a kiss on the dashboard, then took it to the parade ground's low edge and began to push long sleeping berms awake. Boone drove a bus like he was threading a needle, and the other drivers followed as if the road had been a line on paper all their lives. Inside the listening room, the line on the screen learned urgency. Mendoza's voice, usually shy, carried clarity as if the dome itself had climbed into him. 2 lobes, Mendoza said into the radio to Lolly. Primary in the South Wash at 40 meters per minute. Secondary wants to sneak west along the old cattle path and cut the back of the clinic. Copy, Lolly said. Darla, build a lip on the west flank. Use the shipping containers. Yes, I know it's indecent. Tip them gently. We'll apologize to gravity later. The general deployed his engineers without telling them what to do beyond the broad strokes. That kind of trust is rare, and it lowers people's heart rate. They moved with the economy of people who have learned to carry only gestures that work. One set helped Darla anchor the containers with stakes made from rebar and stubbornness. Another set walked with Marta into the edge of the wash where the first trickles of gray had gone frothy and mean, and laid out a line of straw wattles that some Grant had bought a decade ago and no one had ever claimed. The colonel stood at the edge of the bunker door and watched the trace while his hands remembered what pride feels like when it isn't about salutes. Tell me your plan B, he said quietly to Lolly without taking his eyes off the screen. Plan B is we lose the ground and win the people. We don't plant our feet where the slurry wants our knees. We keep the fridge on and the kids busy and the bell ringing, and we do not let the story of this day be about loss without the paragraph that begins with the word because. He smiled, small and private, because you built a place whose first instinct is mercy.
Because we did, she said, and it steadied the world. The slurry arrived at the low fence like a late guest and tried to climb. It carried small branches and anger. It smelled metallic beneath the dust. It mounded against the new berm and sulked sideways like a stubborn child told no. The shipping containers shuddered and held. The straw wattles drank and swelled and lay down in the flow like saints. "West flank holding," Darla reported. "I've got eyes on a leak at the back of the clinic." "Mendoza?" Lale asked. He tuned the trace with 2 fingers, listening as if the earth were confiding a secret. "Secondary lobe's starving. Your lip worked. Primary is hungry. It'll look for another low." Boone's voice crackled through. "Convoy clear to the tower. We've got 20 more people walking the shoulder miles south who followed the siren instead of common sense. Sending a bus back snake-wise." "Copy," Lale said. "Tell them they can yell at me later for installing a bell. Tell them to keep yelling so I know where to send pie." The general's sat phone squawked. He listened, forehead grooved, then handed it to Marta. "County wants to close the state highway and route traffic across the old rail bed," he said. "They're asking if your listening thing can tell them where the bed's soft." "It can tell them where it sings like a drum instead of a table," Mendoza said. "Put them on Channel 5.
Marta made the connection, and in 10 seconds a harried voice that had been born to herd cats said, "You're kidding me, this is some kind of science fair?" "This is a lab built from an old prayer," Lale said evenly. "We'll give you coordinates, you'll give us time." Silence, and then a laugh that wasn't mean. "Deal." They marked the railbed on a map with grease pencil and taped it to the chalkboard over the old radar equation like the past and the present had decided to hold hands. Asha relayed numbers in a voice that had begun the day as a mouse and now resembled a bell. The county moved their barricades not by guess, but by ground truth. The first motorists who had come within a mile of making a film of their own bad decisions instead found a uniformed soldier pointing them to a safe detour with the implacable calm of someone who knows more than your gas tank does. The slurry dropped its shoulders, the leading edge thinned, it spread its anger along the fence and spent most of it in the old arroyo where Lale had asked the kids to dig a swale the day before because the contour had asked so nicely. It licked the base's toes, had no luck, and kept going into the lowland past the parade ground where old tire tracks already had the shape of surrender. By late afternoon, the color of the light changed from knife to honey. The roar in the bunker softened to a murmur like a long argument that had decided it could be held tomorrow. The buses came back empty. The clinic van left with a cooler full of vaccines, cold enough to be smug. The volunteer engines hosed down their own wheels with a sternness that suggested they'd learned that lesson the hard way somewhere else. Bright arrived at dusk, with a face that thought it should be allowed to write the caption under the day's photograph. He didn't get out of his SUV immediately, as if the act of opening his own door might look like submission on a scale he couldn't afford. "You pulled a permit for that dozer?" he asked Darla at last, tone airy as a window in a brochure. Darla wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and smiled with all her teeth. "Honey, I pulled a mountain. Paper can follow." He opened his mouth to find the shape of a threat and then closed it because the general had stepped into his peripheral vision without making a sound. There are very few threats that want to climb a general's shoulders to get out of your mouth. "We'll expect a full incident report," Bright said to Lale instead, weaponizing neutrality. "You'll have it, with maps and temp logs and an appendix of names under the heading People Who Showed Up." He flicked a glance toward the south ridge, where the tailings had laid themselves down in gray exhaustion. You can't reasonably argue the county should keep a derelict research site powered for the sake of a hypothetical. We don't argue hypotheticals. We argue the lives we didn't lose today. He turned away, and for a moment his gaze snagged on the listening room door, on the key panel's stubborn little eye, now patient instead of angry. It was not a look of curiosity. It was hunger wearing a suit. "You'll need security if you're going to keep sensitive equipment. Counties do security for things that make their maps sturdier." Bright left without saying goodbye, which is a choice that writes its own report. The cleanup was 1,000 small generosities. People brought shovels that had been leaned against porches so long they had acquired the shape of patience. Teenagers carried straw wattles like pythons they were learning to charm. The dog found a deflated soccer ball in the back of the hangar and dared a 4-year-old to a game. When the first stars reached down to touch the antenna tower, the base settled into a quiet that wasn't the old silence. It was communal, an exhale that belongs to a room after a fight when everyone is still friends. They gathered in the hangar under work lights that smelled like moths. Lale stood on a pallet because she had not yet built a stage, and because pallets are stages if you step onto them with purpose. "Thank you," she said, and then had to stop because the word was too small and her throat too full. She tried again. "You changed what this place is for. We didn't just keep medicine cold, we kept the story warm. If you brought your fear here today, I hope you left with something else. Take a crate of bottled water on your way out and write your name in the ledger so I can remember you when I tell this tale to my future self."
Applause moved through the hangar like a low tide. The general did not clap. He watched. The colonel clapped once, and it echoed in the dome of the listening room like a knuckle tapping a door. After, when the kids were splayed like commas on the concrete, and Darla had finally let the generator idle with something like pride, the general asked Lillet to walk. They went to the parade ground where the blue of evening made silhouettes of them. "You spoke to my engineers the way I wish my best captains speak," he said without ceremony. "Clear verbs, no performance. You told truth like it was a tool and not a flavor." "It's the only thing that lifts," she said. He looked toward the bunker. "When you opened that room, I assumed I would spend the rest of the day telling you what you couldn't do. Then I watched it listen to a county find its spine. I have seen many rooms full of expensive hearing that never listened to anything that mattered. I don't say this—" He stopped, as if the words might misbehave if they heard themselves coming. "I don't say this often. I was wrong." He took a breath that sounded like it had been scheduled years ago and missed several appointments. "We came to assess, to decide whether to take back what the Army mislaid. My brief to my superiors will contain a recommendation I have not delivered in a decade." "What kind?" she asked softly. "That this site be designated a cooperative civilian training and response facility," he said. "That its unique instrumentation be retained in place under shared stewardship. That its power plant be upgraded, its perimeter repaired, and its purpose written down in the kinds of letters that change budgets." Lillet stood very still. She had expected a fight that would take years and end in a compromise that tasted like cardboard. "Why?" she asked, because she needed to hear it out loud to believe that sound exists. He looked at her the way a map looks at a compass. "Because this is the first time in a long time I have stood inside a room built for war and watched it pour out something else. Because my engineers cried in a listening chamber and lied about pollen. Because your kids told my majors to move a barricade, and my majors did, and no one died, and you kept the insulin cold. Because the ground sang, and you treated it like a choir instead of a target. Because I am tired of making speeches at ribbon cuttings for shooting ranges." He smiled then, real and difficult. "Because I want to stand in front of my peers and make them speechless." She laughed, and the laugh had tears in it. "We'll need money. We'll need to replace those insulators. We'll need a water truck that believes in us. You'll have signatures, and then money follows like a mule follows a carrot." "Carrots need water," she said. "Then we'll find you a mule that drinks from a listening room," he said, and shook her hand the way men shake hands when they are trying very hard not to hug a stranger who feels like a teammate. They signed the forms in the admin office 2 weeks later, under the chalkboard with the question she'd written, "What if the ground could talk back?" The designation letter was heavy paper, with a seal that refused to pick a lane between ugly and impressive. The colonel cried openly and wiped his eyes with a shop towel that had seen both grease and gratitude. The county commissioner, who wasn't bright, showed up with a pie that had cracked in the middle on the drive, but tasted like relief. The upgrades began in a hum, a new inverter that purred like a cat that had taken an oath,
replacement insulators that shone like newly bleached bone, a perimeter fence that said, "We welcome you" by having a gate, and also, "We mean it when we say no." They installed a weather station on the roof of the powerhouse that told wind speed like gossip and recorded rainfall like a scientist who had once been a poet. Martha taught a class every Saturday called Things That Look Harmless and Aren't. She began each session by telling the story of the tripwire and the boy who learned to breathe while he held a flashlight. Darla ran a microgrid workshop that made the words phase imbalance become a punchline. Boone started a map on the wall where people could stick pins in places where the base had helped. The pins multiplied until the map looked like a sky. On a Tuesday morning that smelled like new paint and sage, the army returned, not with clipboards or clauses, but with a camera and 3 generals who had argued in a room somewhere and decided they liked the idea of being stunned on purpose. They wore dress uniforms that made them look like history books. They walked the powerhouse and nodded at gauges with their mouth, but not their eyes. They stood in the hangar and let a drone lift a bag of saline and landed on a deck the size of a pie plate and clapped like men who had forgotten their hands could do that. They ate pie in the admin office and left their forks in the sink because old habits are democracy. Then they entered the listening room. The dome amplified their footsteps until each step sounded like a debt being paid. Lele waited at the console with Asha and Mendoza and the colonel. The general who had walked with her on the parade ground stood back, a small smile tucked in the corner of his mouth as if he were remembering a private joke in which he was both the butt and the audience. "Show us," the tallest general said, and it wasn't a challenge, it was a plea. Asha brought up the array. The trace wrote itself across the screen like a musical staff. Mendoza tuned the gain, and with 2 small motions of his wrist, brought the valley into focus. The dome breathed. Lele spoke because the room needed a voice to transcribe the wonder. "This is the South Ridge. Today the ground is quiet, but you can hear the new channel we cut yesterday. See this faint line? That's water speaking in a smaller voice. This is the railbed. We marked the soft spots. And here," she pointed at a series of gentle undulations, regular as a sleeping animal's breath. "That's the aquifer. You can tell it's healthy because it sighs instead of wheezes." "And that?" one of the generals asked, pointing to a set of fast, bright spikes marching across the trace like skinny soldiers. "Kids on scooters," Mendoza said, deadpan. "We make them promise to keep to the hangar when we're calibrating. They keep half the promise." The generals laughed, and the laugh turned the room into a place where something new could happen. "Here's today's reason," Lele said softly. "We've tied the listening to alerts that don't require a genius to interpret, color bands and plain language. If the ground sings in the key of trouble, the base lights shift, the bell rings, and the clinic gets a text that says, 'Move your fridge.' If the state highway learns a new habit we don't like, the county sees it before a motorist volunteers to learn it with their car." She stepped back and let them come closer to the screen. Soldiers and engineers, men with medals and men with memories. The dome took their inhalations and gave them back like waves. Applause moved through the hangar like a low tide. The general did not clap. He watched. The colonel clapped once, and it echoed in the dome of the listening room like a knuckle tapping a door. After, when the kids were splayed like commas on the concrete, and Darla had finally let the generator idle with something like pride, the general asked Lele to walk. They went to the parade ground where the blue of evening made silhouettes of them.
"You spoke to my engineers the way I wish my best captains speak," he said without ceremony. "Clear verbs, no performance. You told truth like it was a tool and not a flavor." "It's the only thing that lifts," she said. He looked toward the bunker. "When you opened that room, I assumed I would spend the rest of the day telling you what you couldn't do. Then I watched it listen to a county find its spine. I have seen many rooms full of expensive hearing that never listened to anything that mattered. I don't say this—" He stopped, as if the words might misbehave if they heard themselves coming. "I don't say this often. I was wrong." He took a breath that sounded like it had been scheduled years ago and missed several appointments. "We came to assess, to decide whether to take back what the Army mislaid. My brief to my superiors will contain a recommendation I have not delivered in a decade." "What kind?" she asked softly. "That this site be designated a cooperative civilian training and response facility," he said. "That its unique instrumentation be retained in place under shared stewardship. That its power plant be upgraded, its perimeter repaired, and its purpose written down in the kinds of letters that change budgets." Lillet stood very still. She had expected a fight that would take years and end in a compromise that tasted like cardboard. "Why?" she asked, because she needed to hear it out loud to believe that sound exists. He looked at her the way a map looks at a compass. "Because this is the first time in a long time I have stood inside a room built for war and watched it pour out something else. Because my engineers cried in a listening chamber and lied about pollen. Because your kids told my majors to move a barricade, and my majors did, and no one died, and you kept the insulin cold. Because the ground sang, and you treated it like a choir instead of a target. Because I am tired of making speeches at ribbon cuttings for shooting ranges." He smiled then, real and difficult. "Because I want to stand in front of my peers and make them speechless." She laughed, and the laugh had tears in it. "We'll need money. We'll need to replace those insulators. We'll need a water truck that believes in us. You'll have signatures, and then money follows like a mule follows a carrot." "Carrots need water," she said. "Then we'll find you a mule that drinks from a listening room," he said, and shook her hand the way men shake hands when they are trying very hard not to hug a stranger who feels like a teammate. They signed the forms in the admin office 2 weeks later, under the chalkboard with the question she'd written, "What if the ground could talk back?" The designation letter was heavy paper, with a seal that refused to pick a lane between ugly and impressive. The colonel cried openly and wiped his eyes with a shop towel that had seen both grease and gratitude. The county commissioner, who wasn't bright, showed up with a pie that had cracked in the middle on the drive, but tasted like relief. The upgrades began in a hum. A new inverter that purred like a cat that had taken an oath, replacement insulators that shone like newly bleached bone, a perimeter fence that said, "We welcome you" by having a gate, and also, "We mean it when we say no." They installed a weather station on the roof of the powerhouse that told wind speed like gossip and recorded rainfall like a scientist who had once been a poet. Martha taught a class every Saturday called Things That Look Harmless and Aren't. She began each session by telling the story of the tripwire and the boy who learned to breathe while he held a flashlight. Darla ran a microgrid workshop that made the words phase imbalance become a punchline.
Boone started a map on the wall where people could stick pins in places where the base had helped. The pins multiplied until the map looked like a sky. On a Tuesday morning that smelled like new paint and sage, the army returned, not with clipboards or clauses, but with a camera and 3 generals who had argued in a room somewhere and decided they liked the idea of being stunned on purpose. They wore dress uniforms that made them look like history books. They walked the powerhouse and nodded at gauges with their mouth, but not their eyes. They stood in the hangar and let a drone lift a bag of saline and landed on a deck the size of a pie plate and clapped like men who had forgotten their hands could do that. They ate pie in the admin office and left their forks in the sink because old habits are democracy. Then they entered the listening room. The dome amplified their footsteps until each step sounded like a debt being paid. Lillet waited at the console with Asha and Mendoza and the colonel. The general who had walked with her on the parade ground stood back, a small smile tucked in the corner of his mouth as if he were remembering a private joke in which he was both the butt and the audience. "Show us," the tallest general said, and it wasn't a challenge, it was a plea. Asha brought up the array. The trace wrote itself across the screen like a musical staff. Mendoza tuned the gain, and with 2 small motions of his wrist, brought the valley into focus. The dome breathed. Lillet spoke because the room needed a voice to transcribe the wonder. "This is the South Ridge. Today the ground is quiet, but you can hear the new channel we cut yesterday. See this faint line? That's water speaking in a smaller voice. This is the railbed. We marked the soft spots. And here," she pointed at a series of gentle undulations, regular as a sleeping animal's breath. "That's the aquifer. You can tell it's healthy because it sighs instead of wheezes." "And that?" one of the generals asked, pointing to a set of fast, bright spikes marching across the trace like skinny soldiers. "Kids on scooters," Mendoza said, deadpan. "We make them promise to keep to the hangar when we're calibrating. They keep half the promise." The generals laughed, and the laugh turned the room into a place where something new could happen. "Here's today's reason," Lillet said softly. "We've tied the listening to alerts that don't require a genius to interpret, color bands and plain language. If the ground sings in the key of trouble, the base lights shift, the bell rings, and the clinic gets a text that says, 'Move your fridge.' If the state highway learns a new habit we don't like, the county sees it before a motorist volunteers to learn it with their car." She stepped back and let them come closer to the screen. Soldiers and engineers, men with medals and men with memories. The dome took their inhalations and gave them back like waves. "Understood," the tallest general said. And then the word broke because another sound had entered the room. The trace had changed. A low, steady rumble rose from the floor, the kind that turns men's faces toward one another like sunflowers. The dome deepened, and the line across the screen shivered and then smoothed, and then shivered again. It wasn't slurry. It wasn't scooters. It was farther. It was old. "Quarry blast up north?" one general guessed, eager to be helpful. Mendoza tuned. "No. Mismatch on the harmonics. This is thin and long, like a string, not a drum." The colonel closed his eyes and pictured a map the way only a man who has had to ask maps to save him can. "Fault wake," he said. "Not a quake. The mountain rolling over in its sleep." The trace wrote 2 more lines, smaller but in rhythm, like harmony. The dome vibrated in their ribs. Lale whispered the thing the room needed said. "We can hear it breathe." No one moved. No one coughed. Not because they had been told to be quiet, but because they remembered how. One general reached out a hand as if he could touch the line, and his fingers stopped a centimeter from the glass as if a teacher had just cleared her throat in 1963. The general who had walked with Lale on the parade ground looked at the other two and saw their faces do something he had not seen in men like him in a decade. They lost their words on purpose. He looked back at Lale. His eyes said, "Told you." She did not smile. Her chest hurt in a way that felt like hunger had decided to become fuel. The room had been built to hear footsteps that meant harm. It was now hearing the slow amble of a planet. It felt like a sacrament you were allowed to explain. The tallest general found a sentence and brought it into being with care. "We spend so much money listening for enemies," he said. "And here you are listening for neighbors." He swallowed. "I did not know we could do that." "We always could," the colonel said gently. "We forgot to ask." Asha's eyes were wet. Mendoza stared at the line as if it might decide to be shy and leave if he looked away. The general said, turning toward her and then stopping, as if the formality of the address were an apology he wished to withdraw. "Lale, on behalf of a department that often misspells its mission, I would like to say—" He stopped again, at a loss. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly. "You can stand here and be quiet with us. Let it be the first line of the right report." They did. They stood, and the dome held them, and the line wrote a song about a mountain dreaming. When they had finished learning what silence can teach, they left the room and stepped into the hangar where the kids were building something that buzzed, and the dog had found its ball again. Outside, the wind ran a hand across the flagpole and found a note it liked. The bell was still, and would remain so until the ground asked it to sing. Bright's SUV passed on the highway like a dark thought, but it did not turn in. The general pulled his aides close and spoke in a voice that had put men on planes and brought them home. He said, "Write this down. We will request funding for the upgrade as discussed. We will designate the Range Echo Cooperative as a training site for interagency response. We will move surplus equipment here without pretending it is a gift. We will bring back the technicians who built the listening room and ask them to write the manual they wish they had. And there will be a photo of this room on my wall where a different picture used to hang." He paused. "And we will—" He stopped, caught by his own memory of quiet. "We will remember how to be speechless when we should." He crossed to Lale and put out his hand. He didn't hide how hard it shook. He said, "Thank you," simply, "for making me into the kind of officer who gets to tell a better story." She took his hand, and then, because some days insist on it, she let herself be hugged by a man in a uniform that smelled faintly of starch and road dust and the possibility of repair. In the weeks that followed, the base changed and did not. The dozer got a name, painted on with a brush that had previously only known pie glaze, Mercy. The listening room got a laminated sign outside that said, "Please enter like you're at church and your God is a geologist." The clinic got a new fridge that hummed like a promise and refused to be fussy about outlet strips. The county sent a letter that did not contain the word mitigate and did contain the words thank you and partner. Martha took the twins to the ridge and showed them scars in the earth that did not belong to tailings. She said, "Old flood, older than your grandpa. Remember it when you try to tell the land to behave." They nodded and did not try to be clever in the face of age. Micah and Mendoza built a dashboard that a county commissioner could understand without asking his niece. Asha wrote documentation in a hand so beautiful that visiting engineers stole photocopies and tucked them under their pillows. Bone began each morning by ringing the bell once, softly, as a way of asking the day to be the kind that lets men breathe. The dog learned to nap with one eye open and became a legend in its own right, which is a burden for a dog, but the base spread the weight. And Lale? She slept sometimes. She ate sitting down sometimes. She learned to let other hands carry cords. She learned the shape of the word delegation and who to trust with it. She walked at night to the listening room and stood under the dome with the lights down and the ground song in her ears, and she felt the world run under her like a river she could learn until she was old. One evening, months after the slurry and the siren and the day the generals forgot how to make words for a minute on purpose, a storm built over the mountains with the patient malice of summer. Lightning braided the ridge. The first big drops hit the hangar roof with the fervor that matched the kids' laughter. The bell rang once, Bone's gentlest strike, the prayer note, and the base became the kind of place a county goes to when it remembers it has a spine. People arrived with coolers and questions and kids who had drawn the listening room in crayon. The generator ran and no one worried. The vaccines dreamed in the fridge. The dog found its ball in the dark. The dome sang the weather's name out loud, and the dashboard blinked green where green meant safe, and blue where blue meant stand near your radio, but don't panic.
Lale stood in the doorway and let her face be wet with a rain that had traveled 100 miles to find a new job. She felt the hand of the first general, her general, on her shoulder before she heard his voice. "Thought you might like to know," he said, not bothering to hide his smile because the dark let men be honest. "Your line item passed. There's a check with a number on it that will make your inverter purr out of vanity. We've got orders to send trainees, engineers, and medics to learn here and, if you'll allow it, to be taught by a woman who bought a base for $1,000 and built it into a reason for people like me to shut up." She laughed, and it sounded like rain on sheet metal. "I'll need more pallets," she said. "We'll send you lecterns," he offered. "Pallets," she repeated. He held up his hands. "Pallets it is." He paused. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't turned the key?" "All the time," she said. "And then I stop, because the only stories I want to get longer are the ones where we did." The storm crossed the base like a slow parade and continued into the valley with the good sense to refill tanks and not rivers. The listening room wrote down the sound and filed it under home. Later that night, when the last truck taillights had turned into the past tense, when the bell hung quiet and the dog snored like paperwork, Lale returned to the bunker alone. She placed her palm on the panel. The little red eye blinked once, as if to acknowledge the kind of friendship that exists between a person and a door. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the military, not to the county, not even to her younger self who had been foolish and correct. To the room, to the ground, to the idea that an abandoned thing is just a thing that hasn't found its next name yet. The panel did not answer. The dome did in its way. Somewhere far below, water moved. Somewhere far above, wind remembered a song. Lale turned back toward the dark hangar, where work lights waited to be asked to tell the truth about bolts. Her boots made the kind of sound on the concrete that only people who have built their own luck can hear. She smiled, because some stories do not end. They widen. 2 days later, the general brought a small delegation from the state. Governor's aides and a woman from emergency management who had seen too many maps with circles on them.
They kept their mouths shut a lot in the listening room, which is a skill that should have its own medal. On the way out, the woman touched the chalkboard like a pilgrim. I'm going to send you a thing to add to the bottom of your question. A week later, an envelope arrived with a single line printed in blue. What if we listened to each other first? They taped it below the question and the old equation, and a photo of the kids holding the first bag of saline under their drone like a birthday cake. People visited. People trained. People brought stories and took away others. The base hummed like a hive that had decided honey was a plan. The generals sent equipment and then sent their own children to volunteer and called it optics but meant it. The county signed a resolution that said community asset and meant them, and the signatures looked like they had been written by hands that wanted to be invited to ring the bell. Once very late, when only the bats were busy, and the stars had passed their audition and been cast, Lale took her father's old pocket knife from her pocket and pressed it into the palm of the colonel, for the key ring, in case another door forgets your name. He closed his fingers around the little weight. I carried too many keys for too long. I never carried one that opened a room like this. He looked up at the dome with a reverence that didn't feel like a performance. We built a lot of machines that could hear men betray one another. I didn't think I'd live to stand in one that could hear the earth forgive us for trying again. They stood quietly then, two people whose lives had come through the same door from opposite hallways and let the ground have the last word. In the months after, there were other sirens, other summers, other mornings when the bell rang once and the day answered, "Here." The kids grew into people you would hand a county to. The dog learned to prefer the cool spot under the console. Darla installed a row of meters because she liked the way their needles stepped into truth. Marta taught a boy to breathe through panic and then watched him teach another. Sometimes the general came alone in an unmarked car and stood in the doorway of the listening room for exactly 3 minutes, hands in his pockets, lips moving, prayer maybe, or just thank you, said to the one room in the state where he could speak it out loud without being asked to account for the cost. On the anniversary of the day the sirens sang without permission, the county held a little ceremony. No ribbons, no podium, pie, a table with a ledger for names, a new sign on the gate that said Range Echo Cooperative in letters that would not blow away. Boone rang the bell twice, once for the day they opened the gate, once for the day they decided to keep it open. Lale stood back and let other people talk. The colonel told the story of the countdown with enough detail to make a room full of heart rates synchronize and then pause in unison at 03. Mendoza played a recording of the mountain breathing. Asha read a paragraph from the manual that began, "First, we answer the bell," and the crowd hummed in their throats like agreement. At the end, the general stepped forward and looked at her, and looked at the room, and then looked at his hands, which is something he did only when he was trying not to cry in front of teenagers. I came here prepared to be in charge. I left here prepared to be quiet. It's the best demotion I've ever had. He smiled, and it was a good smile. On days when the job makes me forget what it's for, I come stand in your bunker and remember that the ground is louder than my opinions. He cleared his throat. On behalf of people who wear the same clothes to too many meetings, thank you for making us speechless. The kids applauded like a weather pattern. The dog barked once and wagged in a circle and then made a dignified exit. The wind lifted the sign on the gate and set it down gently as if to say, "I accept." That night alone in the listening room, Lale laid her palm on the dais and felt the hum that meant the earth was busy being round. She thought of the first day, dust, heat, a lock that didn't yet know her name. She thought of $1,000 like a dare. She thought of the general's silence, the colonel's tears, March's rules, Darla's laugh, Boone's bell, Asha's handwriting, Mendoza's ear. Micah's adolescent confidence finding a place to practice being true. Her eyes stung, and she let them. The dome above her caught the sound and made a small music of it. "Okay," she said to the room, and to the future, and to herself. "Okay." She turned and walked back toward the hangar, and the pallets, and the people and the work that always greeted her like a dog that knew her step. The night made a pathway of moths, and the generator purred the note of a world that had agreed to keep trying. The base that had been a rumor was now a spine. It had learned to hold. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.